The train's whistle cut through the afternoon like a knife, sharp and final. Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the endless stretch of prairie give way to something harder. Wooden buildings hunched against the wind, streets carved from dirt and stubborn hope. Ashford Junction. The name had sounded almost romantic in the letters. Now, through smudged glass and gathering dust, it looked like exactly what it was. The kind of place people came to when they'd run out of everywhere else. She was 56 years old. The reflection in the window didn't lie about that, though she'd stopped counting the ways it had changed her, the lines around her mouth, the silver threading through hair she'd once been vain about. Vanity seemed like a language from another country now, something she'd left behind along with everything else. The train lurched to a stop. Clara stood, smoothing her traveling dress, navy wool, practical, the best she could afford after selling what little remained. Her carpetbag sat at her feet, holding everything she owned. 3 dresses, undergarments carefully mended, a sewing kit that had belonged to her mother, and $16 folded inside a Bible she hadn't opened in months. Not because she'd lost faith exactly, more because she couldn't bear to ask for anything else. Around her, other passengers were already moving, a family with loud children, 2 men in dusty suits discussing cattle prices, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, her face bright with whatever dreams had carried her this far. Clara waited until the aisle cleared. She'd learned that patience looked better than eagerness, especially when you were afraid. The platform was worse than she'd imagined. Rough planks, some warped from weather, others split clean through. A few people clustered near the station house, but they weren't there for her. She knew that immediately. Their eyes slid past without catching, the way people looked through servants or beggars. Clara stepped down carefully, testing each board before trusting her weight. The air smelled like coal smoke and horse dung and something else. Something raw she couldn't quite name. Behind her, the train hissed and settled, already preparing to leave. She felt a spike of panic, sudden and sharp. What if she got back on? What if she just rode it to the next town and the next, until the money ran out or she did, but there was nowhere to go back to? That was the thing she'd learned, slowly and then all at once, after Martin died. The Philadelphia boarding house had tolerated her for 3 months before the landlady made it clear. Widows without income weren't charity cases, they were problems. Her sister had written once, a brief note that managed to be both sympathetic and final. I wish we could help, Clara, but Richard says we simply haven't the room. Translation, don't come here. So she'd answered an advertisement. Rancher seeking practical woman for companionship and domestic partnership. Must be of good character and sound health. Age no barrier. She'd written back honestly, perhaps too honestly, about her situation, her age, her willingness to work. His reply had been brief but not unkind. Arrival expected 3rd week of April. Will meet train. That was supposed to be today. Clara scanned the platform again. A man in a brown coat was helping the young woman with her trunk. Another was arguing with the station master about a delayed shipment, but no one approached her. No one looked like they were waiting for anyone in particular. She moved toward the station house, carpetbag heavy in her hand. Inside, the station master sat behind a scarred desk, working through a stack of papers with the resigned air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Excuse me?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm looking for Mr. Vernon Hobbs. He was supposed to meet the afternoon train." The station master looked up. His eyes were a watery blue, his face weathered to the texture of old leather. He studied her for a moment, not unkindly, but not warmly either, just assessing. "Hobbs came through about an hour ago," he said finally. "Didn't stay." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Did he leave a message?" "Not with me." The man returned to his papers. "Might check the hotel, or the telegraph office." "Which way is that?" He pointed without looking up. "Main Street. Can't miss it." Outside, the wind had picked up, pulling at her skirts and hat. Clara walked slowly, trying to look purposeful rather than lost. Main Street was barely 2 blocks long. A general store, a saloon that looked like it had been built from spare parts, a building marked hotel in faded letters, and a few other structures she couldn't quite identify. The hotel clerk was a thin man with suspicious eyes. "Help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Vernon Hobbs. I was told he might be staying here." "Hobbs checked out this morning." The The clerk's tone made it clear this was not his problem. Do you know where he went? Lady, I don't keep track of guests once they settle their bill. Clara stood there, carpetbag growing heavier by the second, trying to think of what to ask next. The clerk had already dismissed her, his attention shifting to something behind his desk. She tried the telegraph office next. The operator, a middle-aged woman with sharp features, at least looked at her like she was human. Vernon Hobbs? The woman frowned. He sent a wire this morning, took the early train east. The words didn't make sense at first. Clara heard them, but they seemed to belong to a different conversation, a different reality. East? But he was supposed to meet me. We had an arrangement. Can't say I know anything about that. The woman's voice softened slightly. But he definitely left. Saw him at the station myself around 7. Clara walked out into the street. The sun was lower now, the shadows stretching long across the dirt. She stood there, bag in hand, and tried to inventory what she had. $16, 3 dresses, and nowhere to go. The calculation was simple and devastating. A group of men passed on the other side of the street. One of them laughed at something, the sound carrying on the wind. Normal. Everything here was normal except for her. She made herself walk back to the hotel. The clerk looked up with barely concealed irritation. How much for a room? $2 a night. 3 if you want meals. $2. That gave her 8 nights if she didn't eat, 5 if she did. And then what? Just tonight, she said, counting out the coins with fingers that wanted to shake. No meals. The room was on the second floor, barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building. Clara set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her hat and gloves, and tried to understand what had happened. Vernon Hobbs had invited her here. She had his letters, written in a careful hand, discussing practical matters, the size of his ranch, the work involved, his hope for companionable partnership. She'd answered his questions, sent the photograph he'd requested, an old one, but honest enough. He'd written back confirming the date, the train, the meeting. And then he'd taken one look at her, or maybe he hadn't even bothered looking, and left. The rejection shouldn't have surprised her. She'd been rejected before. In smaller ways, quieter ways. After Martin died, the other widows in the boarding house had stopped inviting her to their card games. At church, the minister's wife had suggested gently that perhaps Clara would be more comfortable at the earlier service, the one for servants and working people. Even her own sister had managed to make her feel like an imposition through nothing more than careful silence. But this was different. This was being discarded before she'd even spoken, judged and found wanting based on what? Her age? Her appearance? The way she carried herself after 3 days on a train? Clara removed her hat and gloves with mechanical precision. She poured water into the basin and washed her face, the cloth coming away gray with coal dust and exhaustion. In the mottled mirror above the washstand, her reflection looked like a stranger, a tired woman in a cheap room at the end of the world. She needed a plan. That was the practical thing, the sensible thing. Tomorrow she would look for work. This was a frontier town. Surely someone needed sewing done, or cleaning, or cooking. She could make herself useful. That had always been her strategy. Be useful enough that people couldn't quite bring themselves to discard you. But tonight, alone in this room with the wind rattling the window and the sound of rough laughter drifting up from the saloon below, Clara let herself feel the full weight of it. The fear, the humiliation, the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to survive in a world that had already decided she didn't matter. She didn't cry. She'd learned that tears were a luxury, something you indulged in when you had the energy to spare. Instead, she lay down on the bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until the light failed and darkness filled the room like water. Morning came too early and too bright. Clara woke with her dress wrinkled and her neck stiff, disoriented for a moment before memory crashed back. She was in Ashford Junction. Vernon Hobbs was gone. She had $14 left and no idea what came next. She did her best with the washstand, changing into a fresh dress and repinning her hair. The face in the mirror still looked tired, but at least it looked deliberate. She'd learned long ago that appearance mattered, especially when you had nothing else to offer. Downstairs, the hotel clerk barely glanced at her. Outside, Main Street was already awake. Wagons moving through the rutted road, men gathered outside the general store. The sound of hammering coming from somewhere behind the buildings. Clara walked toward the store, practicing what she might say. I'm looking for work. I'm an excellent seamstress. I can cook, clean, manage a household. It sounded desperate even in her head. The general store smelled like coffee and leather, and something sweet she couldn't identify. Behind the counter, a stout woman with gray hair piled in a practical bun was weighing out flour for a customer. Clara waited until the transaction finished, then stepped forward. Excuse me, I'm looking for work. I'm skilled with a needle and I can... Not hiring. The woman didn't look up. Try the hotel. I did. They're not... Then try the ranch houses outside town. Some of them take on help during calving season. The woman's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Clara tried 3 more businesses that morning: the saloon, which sent her away before she could finish speaking, a boarding house, which needed no one, and a dress shop so small it barely qualified as a shop at all. Each rejection was polite but firm. Each one pushed her further toward the edge of panic she was trying desperately to avoid. By noon, she was back at the hotel, sitting in the small lobby because she couldn't bear to go back to that room yet. Her stomach was cramping with hunger. She'd skipped breakfast to save money, but the thought of spending $3 on a meal made her feel sick for different reasons. The door opened, bringing in a gust of wind and dust. Clara looked up out of habit, then away just as quickly. The man who entered was tall enough to make the doorway seem small, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested hard work rather than leisure. He wore working clothes, canvas pants, a shirt that had been washed too many times, boots that had seen serious use. His hat was pushed back, revealing dark hair and a face that was difficult to read. Not handsome exactly, but arresting in its quiet severity. He moved to the clerk's desk with the economy of someone who didn't waste motion. Need to leave word for Tom Brennan. Tell him the fence supplies came in. His voice was low, rougher than she expected. Western, but without the exaggerated drawl some men affected. Sure thing, Mr. Hale. The clerk was suddenly animated in a way he hadn't been with Clara. I'll make sure he gets the message. The man, Hale, turned to leave, and for just a moment, his gaze passed over Clara. She looked away quickly, heat rising in her face for no reason she could name. It was just a glance, impersonal, the way anyone might look at a piece of furniture or a stranger in a public space. But something about it made her feel visible in a way she hadn't felt in months. He left without another word. The clerk went back to his paperwork and Clara sat very still, trying to understand why her hands were shaking. By the 3rd day, Clara's money had dwindled to $9. She'd found no work, no prospects, no reason to believe anything would change. The hotel clerk had started looking at her differently. Not with hostility exactly, but with the kind of assessment that suggested he was calculating how long before she became a problem. She'd walked every street in Ashford Junction, knocked on every door that might conceivably need help. The responses ranged from dismissive to almost pitying. One woman had actually offered her $1 to help you on your way, which Clara had refused with as much dignity as she could summon. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. It was the slow, grinding realization that she'd been foolish to come here at all. Vernon Hobbs had been a fantasy, a desperate grab at stability that had never been real. And now she was trapped in a town that had no use for her, with barely enough money to leave and nowhere to go if she did. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she was walking back from another fruitless attempt at the general store when she saw him again, the tall man from the hotel. Hale. He was loading supplies into a wagon outside the feed store, moving with that same purposeful efficiency she'd noticed before. Clara meant to walk past without looking. She'd learned that invisibility was safer than notice, especially when you were vulnerable. But something made her glance over just briefly, and she found him looking back. Not staring, not leering, just noticing. She looked away quickly and kept walking, her heart beating harder than it should have been. Behind her, she heard the thud of something heavy being loaded, the creak of wagon wood. Normal sounds. Nothing to be afraid of. Back at the hotel, the clerk stopped her before she could reach the stairs. Miss Whitmore. His tone was careful, almost apologetic. I need to talk to you about your accommodation. Clara's stomach dropped. She knew what was coming. You've been here 3 nights now, he continued, and I can't help but notice you haven't secured more permanent lodging. I'm looking for work, Clara said, hating how defensive she sounded. Once I find something, this is a hotel, not a boarding house. We have travelers coming through, people who need rooms. I can't hold this space indefinitely for someone who... He trailed off, decency preventing him from finishing the sentence. Someone who can't pay. Someone who doesn't belong. How long do I have? Clara asked quietly. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. End of the week. I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do. 2 more days. $4 left, maybe 5 if she was very careful. And then she'd be on the street with her carpet bag and her 3 dresses and absolutely nowhere to go. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the sounds of the town settling around her, boots on boardwalks, piano music from the saloon, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. She thought about her options, trying to be rational, trying to think clearly. She could take what money she had left and buy a train ticket to... where? She'd already exhausted her connections. Her sister had made her position clear. The Philadelphia boarding house wouldn't take her back. She could try another town, another advertisement, but the thought of repeating this whole humiliating process made her feel sick. Or she could stay here and hope something changed, hope that someone would take pity on her, or that work would materialize, or that Vernon Hobbs would suddenly reappear with an explanation and an apology. But hope, Clara had learned, was another luxury she couldn't afford. She must have finally slept because she woke to sunlight and the sound of voices in the hallway. The loud, cheerful voices of people checking out, people going somewhere, people who belonged in the world in ways she no longer did. Clara dressed slowly, using the last of her water to wash. Her reflection looked hollow, the kind of tired that went deeper than sleep could fix. She gathered her few possessions, preparing for another day of searching, another day of doors closing in her face. Downstairs, the lobby was busier than usual. A family with children clustered near the door, the father negotiating with the clerk about their bill. Clara waited, carpetbag in hand, until the transaction finished. "Miss Whitmore," the clerk's voice was neutral. "There's someone asking for you. He's waiting outside." Clara's breath caught. For one wild moment, she thought, hoped, it might be Vernon Hobbs, that he'd come back, that there'd been some terrible misunderstanding, that everything might still work out. But when she stepped onto the boardwalk, it wasn't Vernon Hobbs waiting there. It was Rowan Hale. He stood beside his wagon, hat in hand, and when he saw her, he didn't smile exactly. His face wasn't made for easy smiles, but something in his expression softened. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was quiet enough that she had to step closer to hear properly. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've been hearing around town that you're looking for work." Clara's mind raced. She didn't know this man, didn't know what he wanted or why he'd sought her out. But desperation had a way of making you bold, or at least making you pretend to be. "That's right," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I'm a skilled seamstress, and I can manage a household. I'm willing to work hard." He nodded slowly, as if considering this. "I'm not looking for a housekeeper," he said. "My place is too far out for that kind of arrangement, but I heard what happened with Vernon Hobbs." Heat flooded Clara's face. Of course he'd heard. The whole town had probably heard. The pathetic widow who'd come all this way only to be rejected before she'd even said hello. "I see," she said stiffly. "Then if you'll excuse me—" "Wait." He took a step forward, and she noticed for the first time how careful his movements were, as if he was aware of his size and trying not to be threatening. "I'm not here to make things worse. I'm here because I thought maybe I could help." Clara stared at him. "Help how?" "I have a cabin," Hale said. "About an hour's ride from town. It's not much. Used to be a line shack before I built the main house. But it's sound, and it's empty, and you'd be welcome to use it. No rent, no expectations, just a place to stay while you figure things out." The offer was so unexpected, so impossible to parse, that Clara couldn't immediately respond. Her first instinct was suspicion. Men didn't offer women free shelter without wanting something in return. But there was nothing calculating in Hale's expression, nothing that set off the warning bells she'd learned to trust. "Why?" she asked finally. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know what it's like to need help and not get it. And I know this town well enough to know they're not going to make things easy for you." He paused, then added quietly, "You shouldn't have to sleep on the street because Vernon Hobbs is an ass." The bluntness of it startled a laugh out of her. Brief and unexpected, but real. She saw something flicker in Hale's eyes, there and gone too quickly to identify. "I can't pay you," Clara said. "I have almost nothing left." Didn't ask you to pay. He settled his hat back on his head. The cabin's yours if you want it. Take some time, think about it. But the hotel clerk's going to throw you out tomorrow, and after that, your options get narrow fast. He was right. She knew he was right. And yet accepting felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. I'll need to bring my things, she heard herself say. Already figured that. He gestured toward the wagon. Whenever you're ready. Clara looked at him. Really looked at him, trying to see past the rough exterior to whatever lay beneath. She'd been wrong about people before. Trusted the wrong man, believed the wrong promises. But she'd also learned that sometimes the choice wasn't between good options and bad options. Sometimes it was between terrible options and slightly less terrible ones. And right now, Rowan Hale's cabin was the only option that didn't end with her destitute and alone. Give me 10 minutes, she said. He nodded and stepped back, giving her space to move. Claire went back inside, climbed the stairs one last time, and gathered her few possessions with shaking hands. This was insane. This was dangerous. This was accepting charity from a stranger in exchange for God knew what. But it was also the only door that hadn't closed in her face. When she came back down, Hale was waiting exactly where she'd left him. He took her carpet bag without asking and loaded it into the wagon with the same care he'd used for the fence supplies she'd seen him handle days ago. Then he offered her his hand to help her up onto the seat. His grip was warm and steady. Clara settled herself, arranging her skirts, trying to look like this was a normal thing, like she accepted rides from strange men every day of the week. Hale climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon lurched forward, and Ashford Junction began to fall away behind them. The hotel, the general store, the railroad platform where her life had first come apart. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and indifferent, beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. Finally, Clara made herself speak. Mr. Hale, I need to know what you're expecting from this arrangement. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the rough trail ahead. Expecting you to use the cabin and not freeze to death. That's about it. People don't do things for nothing. Some people don't, he agreed. But I'm not asking for anything. You need a place. I have one. Seems simple enough to me. And when people start talking, because they will, a woman living alone in a cabin owned by an unmarried man, let them talk. His tone was flat, final. I stopped caring what this town thought about me a long time ago. Clara wanted to believe him. More than that, she wanted to trust the quiet certainty in his voice, the sense that he was exactly what he appeared to be. But trust was expensive, and she'd spent all she had. The cabin appeared gradually, emerging from the landscape like something that had always been there. It was small, rougher than the hotel room she'd left behind, but solid. Smoke-stained chimney, shuttered windows, a door that hung straight in its frame. Hale pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, then reached up to help her. Clara accepted his hand again, that same steady grip, and stepped down into the dust and grass. Well, he said, pulling her carpet bag from the back. Here it is. Clara looked at the cabin, then at him, then back at the cabin. This was her life now, this stranger, this shelter, this gamble she couldn't afford not to take. Thank you, she said, because there was nothing else to say. He nodded once, set her bag by the door, and turned back to the wagon. I'll check on you in a few days. Make sure you have what you need. And then he was gone. The wagon rolling away across the prairie, leaving Clara alone with her choices and her fear and the terrible, fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, this stranger's kindness might be real. She picked up her carpet bag and pushed open the cabin door, stepping into the dim interior. It smelled like dust and disuse, but it was clean. A narrow bed, a small table, a stove that looked functional. Windows that would let in light once she opened the shutters. Clara set down her bag and stood very still in the center of the room, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she let herself breathe. The first night in this cabin, Clara didn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed with her coat pulled over her like a blanket, listening to sounds she couldn't identify. Wind moving through grass, something small scurrying across the roof, the creak and settle of wood adjusting to the temperature drop. Every noise felt like a threat, a reminder that she was alone in a place she didn't understand, dependent on the charity of a man she didn't know. By morning, exhaustion had beaten out fear. She woke to pale light coming through the gaps in the shutters and sat up slowly, her back protesting the thin mattress. The cabin looked different in daylight, still rough, still small, but less threatening. Just a room, just four walls and a roof. Clara stood and opened the shutters one by one, letting in the morning. The view was nothing like Philadelphia. No buildings pressed close together, no streets full of noise and commerce, just prairie stretching out in all directions, broken occasionally by stands of cottonwood or the dark line of what might have been a creek. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Beautiful and completely indifferent to whether she survived or not. She found the water pump outside, worked the handle until it coughed up something brown, and then clear. The cold shocked her hands awake. She washed her face, drank from cupped palms, and tried to think practically. She had no food, no firewood, no idea where Hale's main house was or how far away the nearest neighbor might be. What she did have was her sewing kit and 3 dresses she could tear apart if she needed to. Clara went back inside and opened her carpet bag, inventorying what she'd brought. Thread in various colors, needles of different sizes, scissors that had belonged to her mother, a few scraps of fabric she'd saved for mending. Not much, but she'd built a life from less before Martin died. She could do it again. The problem was that building a life required materials, and materials required money, and she had exactly $4.60 left. She was sitting at the small table trying to work out some kind of plan when she heard the wagon. Her first instinct was relief. Hale had said he'd check on her in a few days, but maybe he'd come back sooner. Then she looked out the window and saw it wasn't his wagon at all. A woman sat in the driver's seat, older than Clara by maybe a decade, with iron gray hair and a face that suggested she didn't tolerate foolishness. She pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down with the stiff movements of someone whose joints complained about the cold. Clara stepped outside, suddenly conscious of her wrinkled dress and the fact that she probably looked exactly like what she was, a desperate woman living in a borrowed cabin. "You must be Clara Whitmore," the woman said. No preamble, no pleasantries. "I'm Ruth Kimball. Rowan asked me to bring some supplies out." "I didn't ask him to." "Didn't say you did." Ruth moved to the back of the wagon and started unloading. "But you can't eat pride, and you sure as hell can't burn it for warmth. So unless you've got provisions I don't know about, you'll take what I brought and save the dignity speeches for when you're not half-starved." Clara's face burned, but she helped carry things inside. Flour, salt, pork, coffee, a few eggs packed in straw, firewood already split and stacked. Ruth worked efficiently, her movements suggesting this wasn't the first time she'd done this kind of delivery. When everything was unloaded, Ruth stood in the middle of the cabin and looked around with an assessing eye. "Rowan said you could sew." "Yes." Clara straightened her spine. "I'm skilled with the needle. I can make or mend almost anything." "Good." Ruth pulled something from her coat pocket, a piece of fabric torn along one edge. "This is from my daughter's wedding dress. She's getting married in 6 weeks, and the seamstress in town is backed up with orders. If you can match this lace and repair the tear without it showing, I'll pay you $2. And if you do good work, I'll tell the other ranch wives about you." Clara took the fabric carefully, examining the tear and the delicate lace pattern. It was fine work, the kind that required patience and a steady hand. "I can do this," she said, "but I'll need thread to match, and I don't have—" In the wagon, Ruth was already heading for the door. "Brought a few spools, different colors. Take what you need and return what you don't use." She came back with a small box of thread, needles, and even a few pieces of fabric in various colors. Clara stared at it all, trying to understand. "Why are you doing this?" Ruth stopped and looked at her directly. "Because Rowan asked me to help, and I owe him more than I can repay. Because this town chewed you up and spit you out for no good reason, and that sits poorly with me. And because I remember what it's like to need help and be too stubborn to ask for it." She paused. "You got questions about that, or can we move on?" "No questions," Clara said quietly. "Good. I'll be back in 2 weeks for the dress repair. You have trouble before then. My place is about 3 miles southeast. Follow the creek until you see the big barn with the red door. Don't be stupid about asking if you need something." And then she was gone, wagon rattling away across the prairie, leaving Clara standing in a cabin that suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a possibility. The next few days fell into a rhythm that surprised her with its steadiness. Clara woke early, made coffee on the small stove, and worked on Ruth's daughter's dress with the kind of focus she hadn't felt in months. The tier was tricky. The lace pattern didn't quite line up, and she had to carefully pick apart some of the existing stitches to create enough slack for a proper repair. But the work was familiar, almost meditative. Her hands remembered what to do even when her mind wanted to panic. In the afternoons, she explored the area around the cabin. Not far, she wasn't brave enough yet to venture too far from shelter, but enough to start understanding the landscape. She found the creek Ruth had mentioned, cold and quick-moving, a stand of cottonwoods that marked what might have been a property line, and once, in the distance, what looked like cattle grazing on a hillside. She didn't see Hale, didn't see anyone except once, when a rider passed on the far side of the creek and didn't acknowledge her wave. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt almost peaceful. No one judging her, no one whispering, no one deciding she wasn't worth their time. On the 5th day, she finished the dress repair. The work was clean, almost invisible if you didn't know where to look. Clara held it up to the light, checking for any puckers or uneven stitches, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride in work well done. That evening, she heard hoofbeats approaching. This time it was Hale, riding a dark horse that looked as sturdy and practical as everything else about him. He dismounted and walked toward the cabin, and Clara stepped out to meet him, suddenly aware that she probably should have tried harder with her appearance. "Mrs. Whitmore." He touched the brim of his hat. "Wanted to check if Ruth brought everything you needed." "She did. Thank you." Clara hesitated, then added, "You didn't have to do that." "Couldn't have you starving." He glanced toward the cabin. "Everything working? Stove drawing properly?" "Yes, it's all fine. Better than fine, actually." He nodded, looking like he might leave, then seemed to change his mind. "Ruth mentioned she brought you some sewing work." "She did. I finished it." That was quick. "I'm good at what I do," Clara said, and was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Something shifted in Hale's expression, not quite a smile, but close. "I don't doubt it." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "If you're interested, I might have some work for you too. Nothing fancy, just mending. Ranch hands are hard on clothes, and most of them can't sew worth a damn." Clara felt her heart speed up. Actual work, regular income, the possibility of not being completely dependent on charity. "I'm very interested." "I'll bring some things by tomorrow then. We can work out payment." "Mr. Hale." Clara made herself ask the question that had been nagging at her since Ruth's visit. "Why are you doing this? And don't say it's just because you have an empty cabin. You're going out of your way to help me, and I need to understand why." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense he was deciding how much truth to tell. Finally, he said, "My mother came out here alone when she was about your age. Her husband had died, her family didn't want her, and she had nothing except some jewelry she sold to buy train fare. She worked as a cook on a ranch until she saved enough to start her own place, just a few acres at first, but it was hers. What happened to her? She died 10 years ago. Built that small place into something bigger than anyone thought possible." He paused. "The men in town called her crazy for trying. The women called her worse things. But she did it anyway. And I learned from watching her that sometimes people just need someone to give them a chance." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Don't be. She lived exactly the life she wanted." He gathered his horse's reins. "I'll see you tomorrow with that mending." He rode off into the gathering dusk, and Clara stood watching until horse and rider disappeared into the landscape. Then she went back inside and carefully wrapped Ruth's repaired dress in clean cloth, ready for whenever the woman returned. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks. Ruth came back exactly 2 weeks later as promised. Clara had the dress ready, laid out on the table so Ruth could examine the repair in good light. The older woman studied it for a long time, running her fingers over the stitches, holding it up to the window, checking the way the lace pattern aligned. "This is excellent work," she said finally. "Better than the original seamstress did, if I'm being honest." "Thank you." Ruth pulled out $2 silver and set them on the table. Then she added 2 more. "The extra is for doing it faster than I expected, and because I'm going to need your help with something else." "What kind of help?" "My daughter needs a traveling dress for after the wedding. Something practical but nice enough to wear in Denver when they visit her husband's family. Can you make something like that?" Clara's mind was already working through possibilities, fabric choices, patterns, measurements. "I can, but I'd need to take her measurements, and I'd need to buy fabric. I'll bring her out here next week for measuring. As for fabric, I'll advance you the money, and you can ride into town with me to pick what you need." Ruth fixed her with a direct look. "That is, if you're willing to face down the good people of Ashford Junction." The thought of going back to that town made Clara's stomach tighten. But she'd learned in Philadelphia that you couldn't build a business by hiding. "When?" "Day after tomorrow. I'll pick you up in the morning." After Ruth left, Clara counted her money. $8.60 now, plus whatever Hale would pay for the mending he'd brought by the previous day. 3 shirts with torn elbows, 2 pairs of pants that needed patching, and a jacket missing most of its buttons. Simple work, but there was a lot of it, and he'd offered to pay 50 cents per piece if the work was good. She could do this. Not just survive, but actually build something. The realization felt fragile, like something that might break if she examined it too closely. The trip into Ashford Junction 2 days later was exactly as uncomfortable as Clara had anticipated. She sat beside Ruth in the wagon, trying to look like she belonged there, trying not to notice the stares as they rolled down Main Street. People watched. The hotel clerk, the general store owner, a few women gathered outside the milliner's shop. Clara kept her chin up and her eyes forward, the way she'd learned to do in Philadelphia when walking past the other boarders who'd stopped speaking to her. Ruth pulled up in front of the general store and climbed down. "Come on. We need fabric for Eleanor's dress, and I'm not about to let you sit in the wagon like you're afraid of them." Inside, the store was busy. Ranchers picking up supplies, a woman examining bolts of calico, children begging their mother for peppermint sticks. The proprietor's wife, the same woman who'd turned Clara away when she'd been looking for work, looked up and her expression froze. "Ruth," she said carefully, "didn't expect to see you today. Need some fabric for Eleanor's traveling dress." "This is Clara Whitmore. She's doing the sewing." Ruth's tone was pleasant but firm, making it clear this wasn't up for discussion. The woman's eyes flicked to Clara, then away. "I see. Well, the dress goods are in the back." Clara followed Ruth through the store, acutely aware of people watching, conversations dropping to whispers. She focused on the fabric, running her hands over different bolts, considering colors and weights. Eleanor was getting married in 6 weeks, early summer. She'd need something that could handle travel but wouldn't be too heavy. "This one," Clara said, pulling out a bolt of deep green wool with a subtle pattern woven through it. "It's good quality, and the color will suit most complexions. If we line it with cotton, it'll be comfortable for travel, but still warm enough for mountain evenings." Ruth examined the fabric, nodding slowly. "How much do we need?" Clara did the calculations in her head. Length for the skirt, fabric for the bodice, extra for trim and facing. 4 yards should be enough, with some left over for alterations if needed. The proprietor's wife cut the fabric with mechanical precision, her mouth pressed into a thin line. When Ruth paid, the woman barely looked at Clara, just wrapped the fabric in brown paper and tied it with string. They were almost at the door when someone spoke behind them. "Ruth Kimball, are you really going to let that woman make your daughter's dress?" Clara froze. Ruth turned slowly, and her expression was pleasant, but her eyes were cold. "Is there a reason I shouldn't, Margaret?" The woman who'd spoken, Margaret apparently, was middle-aged and well-dressed, with the kind of face that looked like it had been arranging itself into disapproval for years. "I'm just thinking of Eleanor. You don't know anything about this woman. She showed up here expecting to marry Vernon Hobbs, of all people, and when he had the good sense to refuse her—" "Vernon Hobbs is a coward who wasted this woman's time and money," Ruth cut in. "And if you're about to suggest there was something improper about Clara coming out here to marry, you might want to remember that your own mother came west as a mail-order bride, same as half the women in this territory." Margaret's face went red. "That's hardly the same thing, isn't it?" Ruth shifted her package. "Seems to me the only difference is that your mother got lucky and Clara didn't, but I suppose it's easier to judge than to help, isn't it, Margaret?" She turned and walked out, and Clara followed, her face burning but her spine straight. Outside, Ruth loaded the fabric into the wagon and climbed up. "Don't let them get to you," she said as Clara settled beside her. "They're small people living small lives, and the only way they know how to feel big is by making others feel small." "She wasn't wrong, though," Clara said quietly. "I did come here expecting to marry a stranger. That's not exactly respectable." "Respectable." Ruth snorted. "Half the marriages in this territory started with advertisements and letters. The only difference is that some of them worked out and yours didn't. That's not a moral failing, Clara. That's just bad luck." They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them. Finally, Clara said, "Thank you for defending me." "Wasn't doing it for you," Ruth said bluntly. "Was doing it because Margaret Henderson is a self-righteous busybody who needs to be taken down a notch every now and then. You just happened to be the excuse." But there was something in her tone that suggested that wasn't entirely true, and Clara felt a small warmth settle in her chest. She had an ally. Maybe not a friend, she wasn't naive enough to assume that yet, but someone who was willing to stand beside her when it mattered. The days began to blur together in a way that felt less like monotony and more like rhythm. Clara worked on Eleanor's traveling dress, carefully cutting the green wool and stitching it together piece by piece. She finished Hale's mending and received 75 cents more than he'd promised, along with another bundle of clothes that needed attention. She planted a small garden beside the cabin using seeds Ruth had brought her, though she had no idea if anything would actually grow. And slowly, almost without noticing, she started to feel like she belonged in the cabin. Not just staying there temporarily, but actually living there. She rearranged the furniture to catch better light for sewing. She hung her dresses on pegs she hammered into the wall herself. She learned which floorboard creaked and how to work the stove damper to keep the fire burning steady. Hale came by every few days, usually in the evening, always with some excuse, checking if the roof needed repair, bringing more mending, dropping off firewood. They didn't talk much at first. He wasn't a man comfortable with conversation, and Clara had spent too many years being talked at to force words where they didn't naturally fit. But gradually, the silences became easier. He'd sit on the porch step while she worked, watching the sun drop toward the horizon, and they'd exchange a few sentences that felt more substantial than all the empty pleasantries she'd endured in Philadelphia. "You ever raise cattle?" he asked one evening. "No, I've lived in cities my whole life." He nodded slowly. "It's different out here. Harder in some ways, easier in others." "Harder how?" "Weather doesn't care about your plans, neither do the cattle. You can work yourself half to death and still lose everything to drought or disease or just bad luck." He paused. "But at least it's honest work. The land doesn't pretend to be something it's not." Clara looked out at the prairie, darkening now as the light failed. "I like that about it," she said. "The honesty." He glanced at her, something unreadable crossing his face. "Yeah, I thought you might." It was during one of these visits that Clara finally asked about the property boundaries. They were sitting on the porch. She'd dragged out the one chair for him, and she sat on the step. And she'd been wondering about it for weeks. "How much land do you own, Mr. Hale?" "Rowan," he said, "and it's about 1,200 acres, give or take." Clara tried to picture that much space, and couldn't. "That's enormous. It's enough to run cattle properly. Less than some, more than others." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother started with 40 acres. Took her 20 years to build it up to what I've got now." "You must miss her." "Every day." He stood, preparing to leave. "But she taught me everything that matters. How to work. How to judge character. How to hold your ground when people tell you you're crazy." He looked at Clara directly. "She would have liked you, I think." The comment caught her off guard, and she didn't know what to say. He was already moving toward his horse, and by the time she found words, he was riding away into the dusk. That night, Clara lay in bed and thought about what he'd said. She would have liked you. Not you would have liked her, but the reverse. As if Clara was someone worth liking, someone worth knowing. The idea felt strange and fragile and surprisingly painful. 2 weeks later, Ruth brought Eleanor out for measurements. The girl was 19, pretty in a simple way, nervous about the wedding, but trying to hide it. Clara measured carefully, bust, waist, hips, sleeve length, and made notes about Eleanor's preferences for the dress style. "I don't want anything too fancy," Eleanor said. "Thomas is a practical man, and I don't want him thinking I'm going to be the kind of wife who needs expensive things." "Practical doesn't mean plain," Clara said. "We can make something beautiful that's also useful. Trust me." After Eleanor and Ruth left, Clara started working on the dress with a focus that surprised even her. She wanted it to be perfect, not just good, but genuinely beautiful. She added details Ruth hadn't asked for, careful pleating at the cuffs, a subtle trim at the collar, buttons she covered herself with matching fabric. It was the kind of work she used to do in Philadelphia when she still thought she might build a real business, before Martin's death and the slow collapse of everything she'd tried to build. She worked late into the evenings, her fingers cramping, her eyes straining in the lamplight. And somewhere in the middle of creating this dress for a girl she barely knew, Clara realized she was happy. Not content, not resigned, actually happy. The work mattered, she mattered, and that was more than she'd felt in years. The dress was finished 3 days before the wedding. Clara had Ruth bring Eleanor out one more time for a final fitting, and when the girl put it on, even Ruth went quiet. "Oh," Eleanor breathed, turning to see herself in the small mirror Clara had propped against the wall. "Oh, it's beautiful." The green wool fit her perfectly, the bodice tailored to flatter without being improper, the skirt falling in clean lines that would travel well. The pleating at the cuffs caught the light when she moved, and the covered buttons looked like tiny jewels running down the front. "You did this?" Eleanor turned to Clara, her eyes bright. "You made this?" "I did. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "Thank you." Ruth paid Clara $10, more than they'd agreed on, and wouldn't hear arguments about it. "It's worth every cent," she said, "and I'm going to make sure every woman at that wedding knows who made it." After they left, Clara sat alone in the cabin with $10 in her hand and something that felt dangerously close to hope in her chest. She had $23 now, enough to live on for weeks if she was careful, enough to buy more fabric, take on more work, maybe even start building something that looked like a real business. But that evening, when Hale stopped by to drop off more mending, she saw something different in his expression, something tight around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "What's wrong?" she asked. He dismounted slowly, not quite meeting her gaze. "There's talk in town." Clara's stomach dropped. "What kind of talk?" "About you living out here. About our arrangement." He finally looked at her. "People are saying things that aren't true, and it's starting to become a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where the minister might get involved. Or worse, the territorial authorities." His jaw was tight. "They're saying you're living here improperly, that there's something inappropriate happening." Clara felt heat flood her face, followed immediately by cold fury. "That's ridiculous. You've been nothing but respectful. You barely even come inside the cabin." "Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what they believe." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I knew this might happen. Should have known it would happen. This town doesn't know how to mind its own business." "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "We could make it proper. Get married. Not a real marriage, just a legal arrangement to stop the talk. You'd keep the cabin, keep your independence. I wouldn't expect anything from you except maybe using the same last name." Clara stared at him. "You're proposing marriage." "I'm proposing a solution to a problem neither of us asked for." He looked uncomfortable, almost pained. "But I'm not going to pressure you. If you want to tell them all to go to hell and deal with the consequences, I'll back you up on that too." "And what are the consequences?" "They could force you to leave, could bring legal action against me for housing an unmarried woman without proper chaperoning, could make both our lives difficult in ways that matter, refusing to do business, turning other ranchers against me, making sure you don't get any more sewing work." Clara sat down on the porch step, trying to think clearly. Another marriage proposal, but this one was nothing like Vernon Hobbs's letters. This one was practical, offered without romance or pretense, a business arrangement to solve a social problem. "I need time to think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need." "But Clara—" He waited until she looked up at him. "Whatever you decide, you're not leaving this cabin unless you want to. I'll fight them on that if I have to." He rode away, and Clara sat alone in the gathering dark, trying to understand how her life had come to this. 2 months ago, she'd been a desperate widow, hoping to marry a stranger. Now she was being offered marriage by a different stranger, for completely different reasons, and somehow the whole situation felt both absurd and terrifying. She didn't sleep that night, just lay in bed thinking about choices and consequences and the strange, complicated arithmetic of survival. Morning came with no answers. Clara made coffee and sat at her small table, watching light creep across the prairie, and tried to think about Rowan's proposal rationally. Marriage as a legal shield. Marriage as a way to silence gossip. Marriage as anything except what marriage was supposed to be. She'd done that once already, in a way. Married Martin because he was kind and stable and offered her a life that seemed safe. She'd cared for him, maybe even loved him in the careful way you loved someone who'd rescued you from uncertainty. But there had never been passion, Never been the kind of connection the romance novels talked about. Just comfort and companionship, and the practical business of building a life together. And when he died, she'd discovered that practical marriages left you with practical problems. No money, no property in your name, no legal claim to anything you'd helped build. So what would a marriage to Rowan look like? He'd said she could keep the cabin, keep her independence. But what happened when he decided he wanted something different? What happened when convenience turned into expectation? She was still sitting there, coffee gone cold, when she heard a wagon approaching. Not Rowan's. She'd learned to recognize the particular rattle of his rig. This one was faster, more careless with the ruts. Clara stepped outside and saw a man she didn't recognize driving a wagon with official-looking lettering on the side. He pulled up and climbed down, holding a sheaf of papers. "You Clara Whitmore?" "I am. I'm here on behalf of the Territorial Land Office." He consulted his papers. "There's been a complaint filed regarding your residency on this property. Says here you're occupying a dwelling without proper legal arrangement or moral supervision." Clara's hands went cold. "Who filed the complaint?" "That's confidential, but I'm authorized to inform you that you have 30 days to either formalize your living arrangement through legal marriage or vacate the premises." He looked up from his papers, and his expression wasn't unkind, just tired. "Look, lady, I don't make the rules, but that's how it is. This cabin belongs to Rowan Hale. If he's willing to let me stay here, doesn't matter what he's willing to do. An unmarried woman can't cohabitate with or be supported by an unmarried man without it being considered morally suspect. That's territorial law, and I've got to enforce it." He tipped his hat. 30 days, ma'am. After that, I'll be back with the marshal if necessary." He climbed back into his wagon and drove away, leaving Clara standing in the dust with the taste of panic in her mouth. 30 days. 4 weeks to either marry Rowan or lose everything she'd started to build. She went back inside and paced the small cabin, anger and fear competing for dominance. Someone had filed that complaint. Margaret Henderson, probably, or one of the other righteous women from town who'd decided Clara's existence was offensive. And now the law was going to force her into marriage or force her out entirely. The injustice of it burned. She'd done nothing wrong. Rowan had done nothing wrong. But the appearance of impropriety was apparently enough to destroy what little stability she'd managed to scrape together. By the time Rowan showed up that evening, Clara had worked herself into a state somewhere between fury and despair. She met him at the door before he could even dismount. "They're making me leave," she said. 30 days, and then the marshal comes to evict me unless I'm married." Rowan's expression went dark. He swung down from his horse and stood very still for a moment, and Clara could see him working to control his temper. "Who delivered the notice?" "Someone from the land office. He said there was a complaint." "Of course there was." Rowan's voice was flat, dangerous in a way she hadn't heard before. "This is Margaret Henderson's doing. She's been trying to run me off this land for years, and when she couldn't do that, she decided to make my life difficult in other ways." "Why does she hate you so much?" "Because my mother refused to sell her husband this property 20 years ago, and because I won't go to their church or pretend to respect people who don't deserve it." He turned to look at her directly. "Clara, I meant what I said before. If you want to fight this, I'll fight it with you, but fighting means lawyers and money and time, and we might lose anyway." "And the alternative is marriage." "A legal arrangement," he corrected. "We sign papers, you take my name, and the gossips lose their ammunition, but nothing else has to change. You keep working, keep the cabin, keep your independence. I'm not asking for a wife in any real sense." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, cold despite the mild evening. "What do you get out of this, Rowan? Why would you tie yourself to someone you barely know just to solve a problem other people created?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was rough. "My mother spent her whole life being judged and dismissed because she didn't fit what people expected. She was too old, too independent, too stubborn to accept help or bow down to men who thought they knew better. And she died respected, but she died tired. Tired of fighting battles that shouldn't have needed fighting." He met Clara's eyes. "I watched that happen, and I swore I'd never let it happen to someone else if I could prevent it. So this is about your mother?" "No." His tone was firm. "This is about you being a good person who deserves better than what this town is trying to do to you. My mother's just the reason I recognize that." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not quite trust, not quite belief, but something in that direction. "If we do this, I need to know what you really expect. Not the version you think I want to hear. The truth. The truth. Rowan seemed to consider this. I expect you to keep being who you are. Keep building your sewing business. Keep making this place yours. I expect honesty between us. If something's not working, we talk about it rather than letting it fester. And I expect that if you ever want to leave, you tell me straight, and we figure out how to end this arrangement without destroying each other. That's all? That's all. Clara turned away, looking out at the darkening prairie. She was 56 years old, and she'd learned that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. But she'd also learned that sometimes you had to take a risk or spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. All right, she said quietly. Let's get married. She felt rather than saw Rowan's surprise. When she turned back, his expression was carefully neutral, but something in his eyes had changed. You're sure? No. But I'm more sure of this than I was of coming out here to marry Vernon Hobbs, and I did that anyway. She managed a small smile. At least this time I know what I'm getting into. Do you? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning Clara wasn't quite ready to examine. I know enough, she said finally. When do we need to do this? Soon, before they can come up with another reason to make trouble. He hesitated. I'll talk to the minister tomorrow. We can do it simple, just the legal necessities. Ruth can stand as witness. All right. Rowan moved toward his horse, then stopped and turned back. Clara, I know this isn't what you wanted when you came out here. I know it's not. He struggled for words. I just want you to know I'll try to make it as bearable as possible. Bearable, Clara repeated. The word should have stung, but somehow it didn't. It was honest, at least. Better than empty promises about love or happiness or any of the other lies people told themselves about marriage. After he left, Clara went inside and sat at her table, trying to process what she'd just agreed to. Marriage to a man she barely knew, for reasons that had nothing to do with affection or desire. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like something else. Defiance, maybe. A way of refusing to let the Margaret Hendersons of the world decide her fate. The wedding happened 4 days later in Ruth's parlor, with no ceremony beyond the legal minimum. The minister, a thin man who looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole proceeding, read through the vows with mechanical efficiency. Clara wore her best dress, the one she'd been saving for special occasions, and Rowan wore what looked like the same clothes he always wore, just cleaner. Do you, Rowan James Hale, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. And do you, Clara Margaret Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Clara looked at Rowan, standing there solid and quiet, and utterly lacking in romance, and thought about all the ways her life had gone wrong, and the few ways it had gone unexpectedly right. I do. The minister had them sign the license. Ruth signed as witness, along with her husband Thomas, who'd been pulled away from ranch work and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. And just like that, Clara was married for the second time in her life, under circumstances even stranger than the first. Ruth insisted on providing a meal afterward. Nothing fancy, just beef and potatoes and bread she'd baked that morning. They ate in awkward near silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over all of them. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. Well, Rowan, I suppose congratulations are in order. Suppose so, Rowan said, not looking particularly congratulated. You'll bring Clara around for Sunday dinner next week. Ruth's already planning it. Tom, I haven't, Ruth started, but her husband cut her off. You were planning it before we left the house this morning. Don't pretend otherwise. He turned to Clara. Fair warning, my wife's idea of a simple dinner usually involves enough food to feed half the territory. Pace yourself. It was the first moment of genuine warmth since the ceremony, and Clara felt some of her tension ease. I'll keep that in mind. After the meal, Rowan drove Clara back to the cabin in his wagon. They rode in silence, the marriage license folded in Clara's pocket like evidence of a crime she couldn't quite name. When they reached the cabin, Rowan helped her down and then just stood there, clearly uncertain what came next. Well, Clara said, I suppose I'm Mrs. Hale now. Suppose you are. He shifted his weight. I'll be by tomorrow to bring some supplies, and we should probably talk about how we're going to handle this. What we tell people, how we present ourselves. As a married couple who don't actually live together? I have a house, Rowan said, about 2 miles north of here. You're welcome to move there if you want, or we can keep things as they are. Either way, we should probably be seen together occasionally, so people believe this is real. Clara nodded slowly. I'd like to keep the cabin for now, if that's all right. It's your cabin, he said. Has been since you moved in, really. I just never got around to making it official. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. What do you mean? I mean, I had the land deed transferred to your name 2 weeks ago. Figured you should have something that was actually yours, regardless of what happened with the marriage. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it out. This is your copy. Clara took it with shaking hands and unfolded it in the fading light. There it was. In legal language she had to read twice to understand. A land deed transferring ownership of the cabin and 5 acres surrounding it to Clara Margaret Whitmore, dated 2 weeks before their wedding. You gave me land, she said stupidly. Seemed like the right thing to do. Rowan, this is... She couldn't find words. This is worth... I don't even know what this is worth. It's worth you having something nobody can take away from you. His voice was gruff. Even if this marriage falls apart, even if you decide you hate me and want nothing to do with me, that land is yours. Nobody can force you off it or use it against you. Clara stared at the deed, then at him, trying to reconcile this gift with everything she thought she understood about their arrangement. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I didn't want it to influence your decision about the marriage. Wanted you to choose based on what made sense, not because you felt obligated. You keep saying you don't expect anything from me, but you keep doing things that make me feel like I owe you everything. Rowan shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Clara. That's the whole point. He climbed back into his wagon. I'll see you tomorrow. He drove away, and Clara stood holding the deed to her first piece of property, trying to understand what kind of man gave away land and asked for nothing in return. That night, she lay awake in the cabin that was now legally hers and thought about trust. She'd trusted Vernon Hobbs based on a few letters and got rejected for her faith. She trusted that Philadelphia society would take care of widows and learned that charity had limits. She trusted that if she just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, people would leave her alone. But Rowan was asking her to trust something different. Not that he'd take care of her, but that he'd let her take care of herself. Not that he'd solve her problems, but that he wouldn't create new ones. It was a strange kind of trust, one that relied on absence rather than presence, on what he wouldn't do rather than what he would. She didn't know if she could manage it. The next few weeks developed a rhythm that felt both natural and utterly strange. Rowan came by every few days, usually bringing supplies or mending work. Sometimes they talked, carefully navigating around the fact of their marriage like it was furniture they hadn't quite figured out where to place. Other times they just existed in the same space, comfortable enough with silence that it didn't feel like failure. Ruth brought more sewing work, her friends and neighbors, word spreading that Clara Hale, the name still felt foreign, did excellent work for reasonable prices. Clara found herself busier than she'd been in years, sometimes working late into the night to keep up with orders. She made 2 more traveling dresses, altered a wedding gown, created a set of shirts for a rancher's sons. Each piece of work brought more money, more stability, more proof that she could build something here. But the town's reaction to her marriage was mixed at best. When Clara went into Ashford Junction with Ruth for more supplies, she felt the stares and heard the whispers. Some people nodded acknowledgement. She was respectable now, legally married. But others looked at her with open skepticism, like they knew the marriage was a sham and were just waiting for proof. Margaret Henderson cornered her outside the general store one afternoon. Mrs. Hale. The title sounded like an accusation. I hear congratulations are in order. Thank you, Clara said evenly. Quick courtship, wasn't it? 1 month you're being rejected by Vernon Hobbs, the next you're married to Rowan Hale. Margaret's smile was sharp. Some might say suspiciously quick. Some might say it's none of their business. Everything that happens in this community is our business, Mrs. Hale. We look after our own, and that means keeping standards. Margaret leaned closer. Rowan Hale has always been trouble. His mother was odd, and he's no better. I'd be careful if I were you. These convenient marriages often turn out to be less convenient than people hope. Clara felt anger rise in her chest, hot and sharp. You know what I think, Mrs. Henderson? I think you're angry because you spent so much energy trying to make my life difficult, and it didn't work. I'm still here. I'm still building a business. And I'm married to a good man who has more integrity in his little finger than you've shown in all our interactions. Margaret's face went red. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose. You already did your worst. You got the land office involved. You spread gossip. You tried to drive me out. And I'm still here. Clara picked up her packages. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She walked away before Margaret could respond, her heart pounding, but her head high. Ruth, who'd been watching from the wagon, grinned as Clara climbed up beside her. That was magnificent, Ruth said. Margaret's been needing someone to stand up to her for years. I probably just made things worse. Maybe, but at least you did it with style. That evening, Clara told Rowan about the encounter. They were sitting on the cabin porch, him on the step and her in the chair, watching the sunset in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible. Margaret's going to cause more problems now, Rowan said. She doesn't take well to being challenged. Let her try. I'm tired of being afraid of what people think. He looked at her with something that might have been approval. Good. Fear makes you small, and you're better than that. How would you know? Clara asked. You barely know me. I know enough. He was quiet for a moment. I know you came out here with almost nothing and turned it into something. I know you stand up straight even when you're terrified. I know you do beautiful work because you care about doing it right, not because someone's watching. Clara felt heat rise in her face. That's just survival. No, it's not. Survival is doing the minimum to get by. What you're doing is building a life. That's different. They sat in silence as the light failed and stars began to emerge. Clara thought about what he'd said, about the difference between survival and living, and wondered which category their marriage fell into. Rowan, she said finally, why did you really marry me? And don't say it was just to solve a legal problem. There had to be easier solutions. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was careful. Because when I look at you, I see someone who refuses to give up even when giving up would be easier. And because I got tired of watching this town destroy people who don't deserve it. He paused. And maybe because it gets lonely out here, and having someone to talk to occasionally doesn't seem like the worst arrangement. That's the most honest thing you've said to me. Figured it was time. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter against the evening chill. It gets lonely for me too, she admitted, even when I'm busy with work, sometimes especially then. You could move to the main house, Rowan offered, not as my wife in that sense, just as someone who lives there. There's plenty of room, and you'd have a better workspace for your sewing. I'm not ready for that yet. I know, just wanted you to know the options there. After he left, Clara went inside and lit the lamp, sitting at her table with the land deed Rowan had given her. She traced her name, Clara Margaret Whitmore, soon to be officially changed to Hale, and tried to understand what it meant to own something. Really own it, not just occupy it or use it at someone else's sufferance. She'd never owned anything before. The boarding house room had been rented. The house she'd shared with Martin had been in his name. Even her sewing equipment had technically belonged to the household, subject to claims from Martin's distant relatives after he died. But this 5 acres and the cabin sitting on it was hers, completely, legally, irrevocably hers. The realization was almost frightening in its implications. 2 days later, she was working on a difficult alteration when she heard a wagon approaching. Not Rowan's familiar rig, and not Ruth's either. Claire set down her needle and stepped outside, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. A well-dressed couple sat in an expensive-looking wagon, and the man driving had the kind of face that suggested he was used to being important. He pulled to a stop and climbed down, not bothering to help the woman beside him. "You must be Mrs. Hale," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "I'm Richard Henderson, Margaret's husband. This is my associate, Mr. Carlyle. We're here to discuss a business matter with you." Clara's guard went up immediately. "What kind of business matter? May we come inside? This is rather delicate." Every instinct told Clara to refuse, but curiosity won out. She led them into the cabin, acutely aware of how small and rough it must seem to people like this. Henderson looked around with barely concealed distaste, while Carlyle pulled out a leather folder. "Mrs. Hale," Henderson began, "I'll be direct. This land you're living on is awkwardly situated. It interrupts a larger parcel I've been assembling for development. I'm prepared to offer you a very fair price to relocate." Clara's hands went cold. "This land isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price." Henderson nodded to Carlyle, who pulled out a paper. "I'm offering $500. That's well above market value for a small parcel like this. I said it's not for sale. Mrs. Hale, be reasonable. You're new to this territory. $500 could set you up quite comfortably elsewhere. You could buy a house in town, establish yourself properly. I'm established properly. Right here. Henderson's expression hardened slightly. I'm trying to be generous, but the fact is, your husband owes me money. Quite a bit of money, actually. If you don't sell voluntarily, I'll simply call in those debts and force the sale that way. Clara stared at him. Rowan owes you money? Substantial sums. Loans taken out over the past few years for ranch expansion. All properly documented, all legally binding. Henderson's smile was cold. Of course, if you sell me this parcel, I'd be willing to forgive those debts entirely. Everyone wins. I need to talk to my husband. Of course. You have 1 week to decide. Henderson stood, Carlyle gathering his papers. After that, I start legal proceedings to collect on those debts. And I assure you, Mrs. Hale, I will collect. They left, and Clara stood in her cabin feeling like the floor had dropped out from under her. Rowan owed Henderson money. Substantial money. Enough that Henderson could use it as leverage to take her land. Had Rowan known about this when he gave her the deed? Was this whole marriage just a way to protect assets from Henderson's claims? The thoughts came fast and ugly, poisoning everything she'd started to believe about their arrangement. She waited until evening, pacing the cabin, her mind churning through possibilities. When Rowan finally arrived, she met him at the door. Did you know? The words came out harder than she'd intended. Did you know Richard Henderson would come here trying to buy my land? Rowan's expression went carefully blank. He was here, today. Offered me $500 for this property. Said if I don't sell, he'll call in debts you owe him and force the sale. Clara felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. Is that why you gave me this land? So Henderson couldn't get it? Was this whole marriage just about protecting your assets? No. Rowan's voice was flat. That's not why. Then explain it to me. Explain why you never mentioned owing Henderson money. Explain why he thinks he can leverage your debts against my property. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, there was something defeated in his tone. I do owe Henderson money. About $3,000 borrowed over the past 5 years for cattle purchases and land improvements. I've been paying it back, but not as fast as he'd like. He met her eyes. But I didn't give you this land to hide assets from him. I gave it to you because you deserve to have something that was yours. The timing might have been convenient, but that wasn't the reason. How am I supposed to believe that? I don't know. He looked tired suddenly, older than his years. But I'm not asking you to sell. I'm not asking you to help me dodge debts I legitimately owe. Whatever happens between me and Henderson, that's my problem to solve. He said he'd forgive the debts if I sell. He probably would. Richard's wanted this land for years. My mother refused to sell to him, and I've refused every offer he's made since she died. Buying your 5 acres would give him access to water rights he needs for the development he's planning. Clara wrapped her arms around herself. And if he forces a sale through your debts? Then I'll find a way to pay him. Sell off cattle, take out new loans, I don't know. But that land is yours, Clara. Legally yours. Whatever happens, you keep it. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his gift had been genuine, that their marriage wasn't just a financial maneuver disguised as kindness. But trust was hard when the ground kept shifting under your feet. I need time to think, she said. Rowan nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Sorry Henderson's trying to use you to get to me. Sorry this got complicated, and sorry I didn't tell you about the debts before now. I should have. After he left, Clara sat alone in the darkness and tried to figure out what to do. $500 was more money than she'd ever had at once. It could buy her a house in town, set her up with a proper workshop, free her from dependence on Rowan entirely. But it would also mean giving in, letting Richard Henderson win, abandoning the first thing she'd ever truly owned. She thought about what Rowan's mother must have been like, a woman who'd refused to sell despite pressure, who'd built something from nothing through sheer stubborn will, a woman who'd died tired from fighting battles that shouldn't have needed fighting. And Clara realized she was tired too. Tired of being pushed around, tired of having her choices made for her, tired of people assuming she was weak just because she'd made mistakes or needed help. She wasn't selling, not for $500, not for any amount Henderson could offer. The land was hers, and she was keeping it, The next morning, Clara rode into town with Ruth, the land deed folded carefully in her pocket. She'd asked Ruth to come early, before most people would be out, but Ashford Junction had a way of being awake no matter the hour. The general store was already open, and she could see figures moving behind the windows of the hotel. "You sure about this?" Ruth asked as they pulled up outside the land office. "No," Clara said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." The clerk inside was the same watery-eyed man who'd pointed her toward the hotel on her first day in town. He looked up when she entered, recognition flickering across his face. "Help you?" Clara set the deed on his desk. "I need to verify that this transfer was properly recorded and that the land is legally mine, free and clear of any claims or liens." The clerk picked up the deed and examined it, his expression shifting from bored to interested. "This is the old Hale Line cabin parcel. Rowan transferred it to you?" "He did. Is there a problem with that?" "No problem, just unusual." He opened a large ledger and ran his finger down the entries. "Transfer was recorded properly. No liens, no outstanding claims. It's yours, Mrs. Whitmore." "Hale?" Clara corrected quietly. "It's Mrs. Hale now." The clerk's eyebrows rose, but he made the notation without comment. "Congratulations. You're a landowner." Outside, Ruth was waiting with something that looked like pride on her weathered face. "How does it feel?" "Strange," Clara admitted. "Like I'm wearing someone else's shoes and trying to pretend they fit." "They'll fit eventually. That's how most things work out here. You fake it until suddenly you're not faking anymore." They drove to the general store next, and Clara forced herself to walk in with her head up. The proprietor's wife was behind the counter again, and her expression when she saw Clara was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Hale, what can I do for you?" The name still felt foreign, but Clara claimed it anyway. "I need fabric. Good quality wool, at least 10 yards, and thread to match." "That's a substantial order." "I have substantial work." Clara met the woman's eyes steadily. "I'm making winter coats for the Brennan family, and they want them finished before the cold sets in." It was a lie. She had no such commission yet, but she needed to establish herself as someone who belonged here, someone whose business mattered. The proprietor's wife studied her for a moment, then nodded and began pulling bolts of fabric from the shelves. While she worked, Clara noticed Margaret Henderson enter the store. The older woman saw her immediately, and her expression curdled. "Well," Margaret said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "if it isn't our newest landowner, I hear you received quite a generous gift from your husband." Clara didn't look up from examining the fabric. "I received property that I'm working to improve, same as anyone else in this territory." "Interesting timing, though, right before Richard approached you about purchasing it." Margaret moved closer. "Some might say suspiciously convenient timing." "Some might say a lot of things," Clara replied. "Doesn't make them true. My husband made you a fair offer, more than fair considering the property's limited value." Clara finally looked at her. "Mrs. Henderson, your husband can offer me $10,000 and my answer would be the same. That land is mine, and I'm keeping it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." She turned back to the fabric, her hand steady despite the anger coursing through her. Margaret stood there for another moment, then swept out of the store with her purchases forgotten. The proprietor's wife carefully avoided Clara's eyes, but there was something that might have been respect in the set of her shoulders. That evening, Rowan came to the cabin carrying something wrapped in canvas. He set it down carefully on the porch before knocking, and when Clara opened the door, he looked almost nervous. "I brought something for you," he said, "if you want it." Clara unwrapped the canvas and found a quilt, old but beautifully made. The patches carefully chosen to create a pattern that looked like waves, or maybe wind moving through grass. The stitching was exquisite, tiny, and even, the work of someone who'd cared deeply about getting it right. "This was my mother's," Rowan said quietly. "She made it the first year she was here, when she was still living in a tent and trying to prove she could make it work. Thought you might understand what it meant." Clara ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling the texture of old cotton and the slight stiffness that came from years of use. "It's beautiful. It's yours if you want it. If not, I understand." "Why would I not want it?" Rowan shifted his weight, because accepting it means something, means this is real, not just a legal arrangement, and I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. Clara looked at him. really looked at him and saw what she'd been too afraid to acknowledge before, that somewhere along the way this had stopped being just a convenient solution to a social problem. That when he showed up at the cabin every few days, she found herself listening for his wagon. That when he sat on the porch step and they talked about nothing important, it felt like the most important conversation she'd had all day. "I told Henderson no," she said. Rowan went still. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. That land is mine, and I'm not giving it up just because some important man decides he wants it." She folded the quilt carefully. "But I need you to be honest with me about the debts. How bad is it really?" He ran a hand through his hair, and she recognized the gesture now as something he did when he was stressed. "Bad enough. I can make the payments if I sell off some cattle, but it'll set me back a few years on the improvements I've been planning. And Henderson knows that. He's counting on me not being able to pay, so he can force a sale of my property." "How much time do you have?" "He can call the notes due any time. I've got 90 days from when he files the notice to either pay in full or negotiate new terms." Rowan met her eyes. "But that's my problem, Clara. I meant what I said. This isn't on you to fix." "We're married," Claire said. "That makes it my problem too, whether either of us intended that or not." "Not the kind of marriage where you're responsible for my debts." "Maybe not, but it's the kind where I'm not going to stand by and watch Henderson use me to destroy you." She tucked the quilt under her arm. "Thank you for this. For your mother's quilt." "You're keeping it?" "I'm keeping it." Something shifted in Rowan's expression, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something important. But he just nodded and turned to leave, and she watched him ride away into the twilight with her heart doing complicated things in her chest. The next few days, Clara threw herself into work with an intensity that surprised even her. She finished Ruth's order early and took on 3 more commissions. She worked late into the night, her fingers cramping, her eyes burning, creating beautiful things because she needed to prove she could. But underneath the work was a constant churning anxiety about Henderson and his threats. She'd meant what she said about not selling, but that didn't solve Rowan's problem. And despite what he claimed, she knew his troubles had become hers the moment she'd signed that marriage license. On the 4th day after her confrontation with Margaret, Ruth showed up with news. "Henderson's telling everyone that Rowan's going to lose the ranch," she said without preamble. "Says he's filing to call in the debts next week, and Rowan won't be able to pay." Clara's stomach dropped. Can he really do that? If the loans are documented properly, yes. And knowing Richard, they're documented perfectly. Ruth sat heavily in the cabin's one chair. "I hate to say this, Clara, but you might need to think about what happens if Rowan loses everything. This cabin is yours free and clear, but the rest of his property, there has to be something we can do. Not unless you've got $3,000 lying around." Clara stood and paced the small space. $3,000. It might as well have been $3 million. She had maybe $100 saved from her sewing work, and Rowan had even less liquidity. Everything he owned was tied up in land and cattle. But there had to be a way. She'd spent too much of her life accepting defeat because she couldn't see a path forward. This time, she needed to find one. "Ruth," she said slowly, "how much would Rowan's cattle sell for if he sold them all?" "Maybe $1,500 if he got a good price. But that's his breeding stock. Selling them would destroy any chance of rebuilding." "What about land?" "His property's worth more, but finding a buyer who could pay cash quickly, that's near impossible out here." Ruth studied her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Henderson wants my 5 acres badly enough to forgive $3,000 in debt, which means those 5 acres are worth more than the actual land value." "The water rights," Ruth said, understanding dawning. "Without access through your property, his development plan doesn't work. He'd have to reroute everything, cost him 10 times what he's offering you. So what if we use that as leverage?" "How?" Clara's mind was racing now, pieces clicking together. "What if we offer Henderson a partial easement? He gets access to the water rights he needs, but I keep the land. In exchange, he forgives Rowan's debts." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "That's actually not a terrible idea, but you'd be giving him what he wants." "Not all of it. He wants ownership. I'd be giving him access, which is different, and I'd negotiate the terms carefully. Limited use, specific purposes, reversion clauses if he violates the agreement." "You sound like a lawyer." "I sound like someone who watched her late husband's relatives pick apart his estate using legal language I didn't understand." Clara sat down, her energy suddenly draining. I swore I'd never let that happen to me again. So I learned. Does Rowan know you're thinking about this? No, and he'd probably tell me not to do it. He probably would, Ruth agreed, which is why you should tell him anyway. Clara found Rowan that evening at his main house, a building she'd never actually seen before. It was larger than she'd expected, built from good timber with a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains. Not fancy, but solid. The kind of place that could weather decades if properly maintained. He was working on the porch when she rode up on the horse Ruth had loaned her, and the surprise on his face when he saw her was almost comical. "Clara, is everything all right? We need to talk about Henderson." His expression closed off immediately. "I told you, that's not your problem to solve." "Too bad, I'm solving it anyway." She dismounted, her legs shaky from the unfamiliar ride. "I have an idea, but I need you to listen before you tell me all the reasons it won't work." They sat on the porch steps, their usual configuration, she realized, even in this new place, and she explained her plan. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You'd really give Henderson an easement across your land?" he finally asked. "A limited, carefully controlled easement, and only in exchange for canceling your debts completely. Clara, that land is the first thing you've ever owned. You shouldn't have to compromise it to fix my mistakes." "They're not just your mistakes anymore." She looked at him directly. "We're married, Rowan. Maybe not the way either of us planned, maybe not even the way most people would recognize, but we're legally bound, and that means your problems are my problems, whether you like it or not. This isn't what I wanted for you. Nothing about my life has been what I wanted. But I'm here anyway, and I'm making the best of it." She felt something fierce rise in her chest. "You gave me land when I had nothing. You married me to keep me from being forced out. You brought me your mother's quilt. So let me do this. Let me help fix this problem so we can both move forward." Rowan looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "Then we'll talk to Henderson. Together." The meeting with Richard Henderson happened 3 days later in his office above the bank. It was a calculated show of power, making them come to him, making them sit in chairs slightly too low while he sat behind an enormous desk. Clara recognized the tactics from dealing with Martin's relatives and refused to be intimidated. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale," Henderson said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I have to admit, I'm surprised you asked for this meeting. I assumed you'd come to your senses about selling." "We're not here to sell," Clara said before Rowan could speak. "We're here to propose an alternative arrangement." Henderson's eyebrows rose. "I'm listening." Clara laid out the terms she'd spent the past 3 days refining with Ruth's help. A limited easement across her property for water access, with specific restrictions on use and development. 20-year term with automatic renewal clauses. In exchange, immediate forgiveness of all debts owed by Rowan Hale. Henderson listened with growing interest, and when she finished, he actually smiled. "You've thought this through." "I have. And you're willing to put this in writing? Legally binding contract?" "With a lawyer reviewing the terms to protect my interests. Yes." Henderson tapped his fingers on the desk, calculating. Clara could see him working through the numbers, what he'd gain from the easement versus what he'd lose by forgiving the debts. She'd structured it carefully to be just attractive enough. "I'll agree," he said finally. "On one condition." Clara's stomach tightened. "What condition?" "That you also grant me first right of refusal if you ever decide to sell the property. I want the option to buy before you offer it to anyone else." Clara looked at Rowan, who gave a tiny shake of his head. She turned back to Henderson. "No, the land stays mine to sell to whomever I choose, whenever I choose. That's not negotiable." "Then I'm afraid we don't have a deal." Henderson started gathering papers, dismissing them. "Wait." Rowan's voice was quiet but firm. "You can have right of first refusal on my property if I ever sell. Not Clara's, mine. The main ranch." Henderson stopped. "You're offering me first rights to 1,200 acres? If I ever sell, which I won't. But if circumstances change, you'd get the first offer." It was a risk, a huge one. But Clara understood what Rowan was doing. He was protecting her ownership while still giving Henderson enough incentive to make the deal. Henderson considered this for a long moment, then nodded. "Done. I'll have my lawyer draw up the contracts." They signed the papers a week later with Ruth and her husband as witnesses. Clara read every line 3 times, her hand shaking slightly as she put pen to paper. But when it was done, Rowan's debts were cleared and her land remained hers with only the easement she'd agreed to. Walking out of Henderson's office, Clara felt something release in her chest. They'd done it. They'd found a way through that didn't destroy either of them. "Thank you," Rowan said quietly as they walked to the wagon, "for what you did. Thank you for letting me do it." He helped her up onto the seat, his hand warm and steady on hers. "Clara, I need to tell you something." "All right. When I married you, I told myself it was just a practical arrangement, a way to solve your problem and maybe do something decent for once." He wasn't looking at her, staring instead at the horizon. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being just practical. And I don't know what to do about that. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I look forward to seeing you. I mean, I care what happens to you beyond just making sure you're safe and fed. I mean," he finally met her eyes. "I mean, this started to feel real, and that scares me because I don't know if you feel the same way." She could deflect, could pretend she didn't understand what he was saying, could protect herself by keeping the walls up that she'd spent a lifetime building. Or she could tell the truth. "I feel it too," she said quietly, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I'm 56 years old and I've already had one marriage that was more about practicality than passion. I don't know if I can survive another one." She twisted her hands together. "But I also don't know if I want to keep pretending this is just a legal arrangement when it's starting to feel like something else." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "So what do we do?" "I don't know. Maybe we just see what happens. Stop trying to define it and just let it be whatever it's going to be." "That seems terrifying." "Everything about this is terrifying," Clara said. "Might as well be terrified together." He laughed, a real laugh, rough and surprised, and drove them back toward the cabin. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Clara thought that maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to understand what home felt like. That night, alone in the cabin with her mother's quilt spread over her bed, Clara thought about trust and risk and all the ways a life could turn out differently than planned. She'd come to Ashford Junction expecting to marry one man and had ended up married to another. She'd expected rejection and had found, if not quite acceptance, at least the possibility of belonging. And she'd discovered that sometimes the most terrifying thing wasn't taking a risk. It was refusing to take one and spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been. The next morning, she woke to find something new on her porch. A small wooden box with a note in Rowan's careful handwriting. "Thought you might need these." Inside were packets of seeds, carefully labeled in a hand that wasn't Rowan's. Flowers mostly, varieties she recognized from Philadelphia gardens. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in cloth, was a small silver locket. Clara opened it with shaking hands and found 2 photographs inside. One of a woman who must have been Rowan's mother, her face weathered but strong, her eyes direct and uncompromising. The other side was empty, waiting. She sat on the porch step holding that locket and cried for the first time since arriving in Ashford Junction. Not from sadness or fear or even relief, but from the overwhelming realization that she was being seen, really seen, by someone who understood what it meant to fight for belonging in a world that didn't want to make room for you. When Rowan came by that evening, she was wearing the locket. He saw it immediately, and something in his face softened. "It suits you. Thank you for the seeds. And for this. My mother would have wanted you to have it. She always said that the people worth keeping were the ones who knew how to grow things, even in hard ground." Clara touched the locket, feeling the weight of it against her chest. "I'm going to try to be worth keeping." "You already are," Rowan said. "You've been worth keeping since the moment you stepped off that train and refused to give up, even when every reasonable person would have." They sat together on the porch as darkness fell, not touching but not quite separate either. And Clara thought that maybe this was what real marriage looked like. Not the romantic fantasy she'd given up believing in, but something quieter and more solid. 2 people choosing each other, day after day, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. "I want to show you something," Rowan said after a while. "Will you come with me?" Clara followed him to his wagon, and they drove through the twilight to a place she'd never seen before. a slight rise in the land where you could see for miles in every direction. He stopped the wagon and helped her down, and they stood together looking out at the territory spread below them. "This is where my mother used to come when things got hard," Rowan said. "When people told her she was crazy for trying to build something out here, when the work seemed impossible, when she wasn't sure she could keep going, she'd come here and look at all this space and remember why she'd started. Why did she start? Because she wanted something that was hers, something nobody could take away or tell her she didn't deserve." He looked at Clara. "Same reason you're here, I think." Clara thought about that, about deserving and earning, and all the ways she'd tried to justify her existence to people who'd already decided she didn't matter. And she realized that maybe the point wasn't to convince them. Maybe the point was to convince herself. "I want to build something here," she said. "Not just survive, but actually build something that lasts. Then we'll build it together." It wasn't a proposal, not in the traditional sense. It was something better, a promise that they'd face whatever came next as partners, that the legal arrangement they'd started with had transformed into something real and worth protecting. They drove back to the cabin in comfortable silence, and when Rowan left that night, Clara stood in the doorway watching him go and realized she didn't feel alone anymore. Not truly alone. Not in the way that had haunted her since Martin died. She had land, she had work, she had the beginnings of respect from people like Ruth who valued strength over propriety. And she had Rowan, complicated, reserved Rowan, who'd given her a chance when nobody else would, and who'd somehow become the most important person in her new life. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but standing there in the doorway of her cabin, on her land, wearing a locket that held the photograph of a woman who'd fought the same battles she was fighting, Clara thought that maybe it was better than anything she could have planned. Maybe it was exactly the life she was meant to have. The seeds Rowan had given her went into the ground the next morning. Clara worked the soil with hands that had grown stronger from months of frontier life, pressing each seed carefully into the earth like a promise. She didn't know if anything would grow. The prairie soil was different from the gardens she'd tended back east, harder and less forgiving. But she planted them anyway, because that's what you did when someone gave you the possibility of beauty. You tried. Rowan found her there mid-morning, kneeling in the dirt beside the cabin with her skirts tucked up and soil under her fingernails. "You're already planting them," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd expected her to wait, to plan, to approach it more carefully. "No point in waiting," Clara said without looking up. "Either they'll grow or they won't, but they definitely won't grow sitting in a box." He crouched down beside her, picking up one of the empty seed packets. "My mother used to say the same thing, said that people spent so much time planning for the perfect conditions that they forgot to actually live." She sounds like she was a wise woman. "She was stubborn as hell and twice as difficult," Rowan said. "But yes, she was wise." They worked together in silence for a while, him digging small holes and her pressing seeds into them. The morning sun was warm on Clara's back, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark was singing. It felt domestic in a way that should have been uncomfortable but wasn't. "I've been thinking," Rowan said finally, "about what you said, about seeing where this goes instead of trying to define it." Clara's hand stilled. And I think maybe we should make it more official. Not just legally married, but actually living like married people." He paused. "I'd like you to move to the main house, if you want to." Clara sat back on her heels, studying him. "Why now?" "Because pretending this is still just a convenient arrangement is starting to feel like a lie. And because—" He struggled for words. "Because I'd like to come home to someone at the end of the day. Someone who's there because they want to be, not because they're obligated. I'd keep the cabin, though, for my sewing work, and because it's mine. Of course. That was never in question." Clara looked at the small cabin that had been her refuge, her first real home, the place where she'd learned she could survive on her own. Leaving it felt like abandoning something important. But Rowan wasn't asking her to give it up, just to expand beyond it. "All right," she said, "I'll move to the main house. But I'm keeping my independence. My work, my land, my right to make my own decisions. Wouldn't want it any other way." They finished planting the seeds, and when Clara stood up, Rowan took her dirt-stained hand and held it for a moment. Not pulling her close, not making promises he might not keep, just holding her hand like it mattered. "We're really doing this," Clara said. "Seems like we are." She moved her belongings to the main house 3 days later, and it was both easier and harder than she'd expected. Easier because she didn't own much. Her clothes, her sewing equipment, a few personal items. Harder because each item she carried felt like she was making a commitment she'd sworn she'd never make again. The main house was larger than she'd realized from the outside. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a kitchen that actually had a proper stove, a parlor with windows that caught the afternoon light. It was the kind of house she'd dreamed of having with Martin, but never quite achieved. "You can have the bedroom at the front," Rowan said, carrying her trunk up the stairs. "It gets the best light, and there's space for your sewing table." Clara noticed he didn't say "our bedroom," and felt both relieved and strangely disappointed. They were married, but apparently still navigating what that meant in practical terms. She spent the first week organizing her space, turning the front bedroom into something that was half sleeping quarters and half workshop. Her sewing table fit perfectly under the window, and she hung her dresses in the wardrobe with a sense of permanence she'd never felt in the Philadelphia boarding house or even in the cabin. Rowan gave her space, which she appreciated. He worked long days with the cattle, coming home dusty and tired, and they'd eat dinner together at the kitchen table with conversation that was becoming easier. They talked about the ranch, about her sewing commissions, about Ruth's gossip from town, small things, safe things. But underneath the ordinary conversations was something else building, something neither of them quite knew how to name. It came to a head 3 weeks after she'd moved in. Clara had been working on a particularly difficult alteration, a wedding dress that needed to be taken in substantially without compromising the beadwork. She'd been at it for hours, her neck aching and her patience wearing thin, when a bead rolled off the table and disappeared into a crack in the floorboards. "Damn it," she muttered, getting down on her hands and knees to try to retrieve it. "Problem?" Rowan's voice came from the doorway. "Lost a bead. It's custom made, and I don't have a replacement." He came over and looked at the crack. "Let me try." He had larger hands than hers, but somehow he managed to work the bead free, holding it up triumphantly. Clara laughed, actually laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. "My hero," she said, only half mocking. "All in a day's work, saving beads and whatnot." He was smiling, really smiling, and Clara realized she'd never seen him look this relaxed. She took the bead from his palm, and their fingers brushed. Neither of them moved away. "Clara," Rowan said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you regret it? Marrying me instead of just fighting the town and taking your chances?" She thought about that. Really thought about it. "No," she said finally. "I regret a lot of things about how I got here. I regret trusting Vernon Hobbs. I regret not having saved more money before Martin died. I regret being naive enough to think people would help me just because I needed help." She looked up at him. "But I don't regret marrying you. Even when it's been difficult, even when I've been scared, I don't regret this." "Good." He was still holding her hand, "because I don't regret it either." The kiss happened so naturally that later Clara couldn't have said who moved first. Just that one moment they were talking, and the next his mouth was on hers, tentative at first, and then more certain. She kissed him back, her free hand coming up to his chest, feeling his heart beating hard under her palm. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't want to pressure you. Didn't want you to feel like this was something you owed me." Clara laughed softly. "Rowan, I'm 56 years old. If I didn't want you to kiss me, I would have said so." Noted for future reference. They stood there for a moment longer, neither quite ready to let go. Finally, Clara stepped back, smoothing her dress self-consciously. "I should finish this alteration, and I should check on the cattle." But neither of them moved, and the air between them felt charged with all the things they still weren't saying. Finally, Rowan cleared his throat. "Clara, I don't want separate bedrooms anymore, if you're comfortable with that." She'd been expecting the question or something like it. Had been thinking about it herself, actually, during the long hours she spent sewing while he was out working. "I'm comfortable with that," she said. That night, they shared a bed for the first time as an actual married couple, and it was awkward and tender and nothing like the romantic fantasies Clara had given up believing in decades ago. They were both too old to pretend they knew what they were doing, too scarred by previous disappointments to make grand pronouncements. But afterward, lying in the darkness with Rowan's arm around her and his steady breathing in her ear, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Like she could be exactly who she was, difficult, stubborn, complicated, and he'd still choose to stay. The next few months passed in a rhythm that felt almost suspiciously stable. Clara's sewing business continued to grow, word spreading beyond just Ruth's friends to women from neighboring ranches, and even a few from towns further out. She raised her prices and found that people were willing to pay for quality work. The money accumulated slowly but steadily, $50, then $100, then more. She planted a garden beside the main house, vegetables this time along with the flowers. The frontier soil turned out to be more forgiving than she'd expected, or maybe she'd just learned how to work with it. Either way, green shoots started appearing, and then actual vegetables she could harvest and cook. Rowan taught her to ride properly, not just the nervous clutching she'd done on Ruth's borrowed horse, but actual competent riding. She fell off twice, once spectacularly, landing in a mud puddle that had her swearing like a ranch hand. But she got back on because that's what you did out here. You got back on. The town's attitude toward her shifted gradually. Not acceptance exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement that she wasn't going anywhere. Women who'd whispered about her started nodding when they passed on the street. The general store proprietor began setting aside fabric she thought Clara might like. Small gestures, but they mattered. Margaret Henderson remained hostile, but even her venom seemed to have less bite now that Clara had refused to be driven out. Once, Clara saw her in town and walked right past without acknowledging her. And the look on Margaret's face suggested she understood exactly what that meant. You don't matter to me anymore. But the real change happened the day Eleanor Kimball came to visit, wearing the green traveling dress Clara had made and carrying news. "I'm pregnant," Eleanor announced, her face glowing. "And Thomas wants to commission a complete layette, gowns, blankets, everything. He said to spare no expense because you're the finest seamstress in the territory." Clara felt her throat tighten. "That's very generous of him." "It's the truth." Eleanor looked around the parlor, taking in the sewing equipment and the half-finished projects. "You've built something real here, Mrs. Hale. Mother keeps saying you're an example of what women can accomplish when people give them a chance." After Eleanor left, Clara sat alone in her workroom and let herself feel proud. Not just satisfied, not just relieved, actually proud of what she'd accomplished. She'd arrived in Ashford Junction with almost nothing, been rejected and dismissed and nearly destroyed, and she'd survived it. More than survived it. She'd built a business, claimed land, married a good man, and established herself as someone whose work had value. That evening, she told Rowan about Eleanor's commission. "A complete layette," he said, whistling low. "That's substantial work." "It is, and I'm going to need help." She'd been thinking about this for weeks. "I want to hire an apprentice, someone from town who needs work and has decent hands. I can teach them the basics and pay them for their time." "You're going to train your competition?" "I'm going to train the next generation of seamstresses. There's enough work for all of us, and if I'm going to build something that lasts beyond just me, I need to think bigger." Rowan looked at her with something that might have been awe. "My mother would have loved you. She used to say the same thing, that success you couldn't share wasn't real success." "I wish I could have met her." "Me too." He pulled Clara close, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "But I think she'd see herself in what you're building, the stubbornness, the refusal to quit, the way you find solutions instead of just complaining about problems. I learned from watching you do the same thing." "We learned from each other," Rowan corrected. "That's how this works." Clara hired her apprentice 2 weeks later, a shy 16-year-old named Alice, whose father had died and whose mother was struggling to feed 4 younger children. Alice had quick fingers and a good eye, and more importantly, she was hungry to learn. Clara started her on simple alterations and mending, teaching her the way her own mother had taught her, patiently, with corrections that focused on improvement rather than criticism. Within a month, Alice was handling basic commissions on her own, freeing Clara to focus on the more complex work. Within 2 months, Clara was paying her enough that Alice's mother stopped looking quite so worn down. And watching Alice gain confidence, watching her transform from a frightened girl into a competent craftswoman, gave Clara a satisfaction that went deeper than any amount of money. But it was what happened at the territorial fair that changed everything. The fair happened every year in late summer, drawing people from ranches and towns all across the territory. There were competitions for livestock, produce, baking, and crafts. Clara had never attended before, had barely known it existed, but Ruth insisted. "You need to enter something," Ruth said. "Let people see what you can do." "I'm not a competitor. I'm a businesswoman." "You're both, and you're good enough to win. Hell, you're good enough to make everyone else look like amateurs." So Clara, with Rowan's encouragement and Alice's help, created a dress specifically for the fair. She chose burgundy silk, expensive but worth it, and poured every skill she'd learned over 40 years into the construction. The bodice was perfectly fitted, the sleeves set in with invisible stitching, the hem weighted just enough to fall in perfect lines. She added beadwork at the collar and cuffs, subtle but exquisite, the kind of detail that separated competent work from mastery. When she pinned it to the display board on the morning of judging, she felt a flutter of nerves she hadn't expected. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about being seen, really seen, as someone whose work had value. The judges were 3 women from the territorial capital, brought in specifically because they had no local connections. They moved through the displays methodically, examining each entry with professional detachment. When they reached Clara's dress, they stopped. One of them, a severe woman with gray hair pulled back tightly, ran her fingers over the beadwork. Another examined the seams, turning the dress to check the inside construction. The third studied the way the silk draped. They conferred quietly among themselves, made notes, and moved on. Clara waited through the rest of the morning, watching other competitions and trying not to think about the dress. Rowan stayed beside her, solid and quiet, his presence alone a kind of comfort. When they announced the winners in the afternoon, Clara's hands were shaking. Third place in ladies' garments goes to Sarah Mitchell of Cooper's Creek. Polite applause. Sarah collected her ribbon, beaming. Second place goes to Dorothy Brennan of Ashford Junction. More applause. Dorothy looked pleased but not surprised. And first place, with unanimous decision from the judges, the announcer paused for effect. Clara Hale of Ashford Junction. The applause that followed was louder, and Clara walked to the platform in a daze. The severe judge who'd examined her work handed her the blue ribbon and leaned in close. "That's professional level work," she said quietly. "Best we've seen in 3 years of judging this territory. If you ever want to work in Denver or San Francisco, come find me." Clara took the ribbon with trembling hands and looked out at the crowd. She saw Ruth beaming, Eleanor clapping enthusiastically, Alice looking like she might burst with pride. And she saw Margaret Henderson standing at the back, her expression sour but defeated. But most of all, she saw Rowan standing apart from the crowd with tears in his eyes that he wasn't bothering to hide. That night, lying in bed with the blue ribbon on the nightstand and Rowan's arm around her, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not contentment, exactly. She'd learned that contentment was something you built day by day, not something that arrived and stayed, but satisfaction. The bone-deep satisfaction of knowing she'd proven herself not just to the town, but to herself. "I'm proud of you," Rowan said into the darkness. "Thank you." "No, I mean it. What you've built here, it's remarkable. You came to this territory with nothing, got rejected and dismissed, and instead of giving up, you built something that matters. You're teaching Alice. You're creating beautiful things. You're showing people what's possible when they stop trying to define you and let you define yourself." Clara rolled over to face him. "You did the same thing for me. Gave me the space to figure out who I could be instead of trying to make me fit some predetermined role. We did it for each other," he said. "That's what makes it work." She kissed him then, soft and unhurried, and thought about all the different kinds of love that existed in the world. The passionate love of romance novels, yes, but also this, the steady, choosing each other daily kind of love that built foundations strong enough to weather anything. The next few months brought changes that felt both inevitable and surprising. Clara's business continued to expand, and she hired a second apprentice, an older woman whose husband had left her with debts she was struggling to pay. Between the 3 of them, they could handle more work than Clara had ever imagined possible. She also started teaching occasional classes, showing women basic sewing skills so they could mend their own family's clothing. She charged almost nothing for these classes, remembering what it was like to have more time than money. Ruth said she was crazy to give away her knowledge, but Clara disagreed. "The more women who can do basic sewing, the more they'll appreciate professional work when they need it," she explained. "And besides, teaching helps me understand my own skills better." Rowan's ranch prospered too, partially because he was no longer saddled with Henderson's debts, but mostly because he was good at what he did. He bought more cattle, improved his breeding stock, hired 2 ranch hands who actually showed up and worked. The property that his mother had started with 40 acres and stubborn will was becoming something substantial. And through it all, Clara and Rowan built something together that neither of them had expected: an actual marriage. Not the romantic fantasy that young people dreamed about, not the practical arrangement they'd started with, but something richer and more complicated. They fought sometimes, usually about money or priorities or whose turn it was to deal with some tedious problem. But they also laughed together, worked together, built a life together that felt solid in ways Clara had stopped believing possible. The real test came the following spring when Vernon Hobbs showed up at the ranch. Clara was in her garden when she heard the horse approaching, and when she looked up and saw who it was, her first instinct was to go inside and pretend she wasn't home. But she'd spent too much of her life hiding from difficult situations. She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands, and waited. Hobbs looked older than she remembered, though it had only been a year. Thinner, too, with a haunted quality around his eyes that suggested things hadn't gone well for him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, climbing down from his horse. "It's Mrs. Hale now." His face flushed. "Right. I heard you'd married. I came to apologize." Clara crossed her arms. "All right, I'm listening. What I did, leaving without even meeting you, it was cowardly and cruel. I convinced myself I had good reasons, but the truth is I panicked. You weren't what I expected, and instead of giving you a chance, I just ran." He looked down at his boots. "I'm sorry. You deserved better than that." Clara studied him, trying to find anger or hurt, but all she felt was a distant sort of pity. This man had rejected her, yes, but in doing so, he'd inadvertently given her something better than what she'd been seeking. "Why are you here, Vernon?" "Because I heard what you've built. Heard you're one of the most successful seamstresses in the territory. Heard you married Rowan Hale and helped him save his ranch. And I wanted you to know that I realize what I threw away." "You didn't throw me away," Clara said quietly. "You gave me the opportunity to find something better. So in a strange way, I should probably thank you. I don't deserve your gratitude." "No, you don't. But I'm not giving it to you for your sake. I'm giving it to mine. Because holding on to anger about what you did would poison what I've built, and I'm not willing to let that happen." Vernon looked like he wanted to say more, but Rowan had come around the side of the house, and his expression was not friendly. "Hobbs," he said flatly, "didn't expect to see you here. I came to apologize to your wife. I'm leaving now." "Good idea." After Vernon rode away, Rowan turned to Clara. "You all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She looked up at him. Seeing him helped me realize something. I spent so long thinking I'd failed because he rejected me. But I didn't fail. He did. He had the chance to know me, to build something with me, and he was too afraid or too narrow-minded to take it. "His loss," Rowan said. "Definitely his loss." Clara smiled. "And your gain." "Our gain," he corrected, pulling her close. "Seems like everything good that's happened to me started the day you showed up in Ashford Junction." That summer, Clara's mother's quilt, the one Rowan had given her months ago, started showing wear along one edge. Clara examined it carefully, noting where the stitching had come loose and the fabric had begun to fray. It was old, well-loved, and in need of restoration. She spent 3 weeks carefully taking it apart, section by section, documenting the pattern so she could reconstruct it exactly. Some pieces were beyond saving, and she replaced them with new fabric carefully chosen to match the original colors. She restitched every seam, reinforced every weak point, and when she was finished, the quilt looked almost new while still maintaining its essential character. When she gave it back to Rowan, he held it like it was precious. "You fixed it," he said, his voice rough. "I restored it. There's a difference. It's still the same quilt your mother made. I just gave it a chance to last longer." He looked at her then with an expression that made her breath catch. "You know that's what you did for me too, right? Restored me. Gave me a reason to care about something beyond just surviving day to day." "We restored each other," Clara said. That's the truth of it." They hung the quilt on the bed they shared, and every night Clara looked at it and thought about Rowan's mother, the woman who'd started with nothing and built something that lasted, the woman whose stubbornness and strength had somehow made it possible for Clara to find her own. By the time autumn arrived, Clara had been in Ashford Junction for 18 months. The anniversary passed without particular fanfare, but Clara marked it privately, taking stock of everything that had changed. She owned land. She ran a successful business with 2 apprentices and plans to hire a third. She had a real marriage with a man she'd grown to love in ways she hadn't expected love could feel at her age. She had respect from people who mattered and indifference from people who didn't. And she had herself, not the defeated widow who'd stepped off the train expecting to marry a stranger, but someone harder and softer at the same time. Someone who knew how to fight for what mattered and let go of what didn't. The town still had its Margaret Hendersons, its people who thought Clara didn't quite belong or that her success was somehow undeserved. But they mattered less now. Their opinions couldn't touch what she'd built. One evening in late October, she and Rowan rode out to the place his mother used to visit, the rise where you could see for miles in every direction. They sat on the wagon seat watching the sunset painting the prairie in impossible colors. "Do you ever regret it?" Rowan asked. "Coming out here? Everything that happened after?" Clara thought about that, really thought about it. About the humiliation of being rejected by Vernon Hobbs, the fear of almost losing everything, the hard work of building a business from nothing. About all the ways her life could have gone differently if she'd made different choices. "No," she said finally. "I regret some of the things that happened along the way. I regret trusting people who didn't deserve it and doubting people who did. But coming here? Marrying you? Building this life?" She shook her head. "Those aren't things I regret. Those are things I'm grateful for. Even though it was hard, especially because it was hard. Easy things don't teach you who you really are. Hard things show you what you're made of." Rowan took her hand and they sat together in the gathering darkness. 2 people who'd found each other through circumstance and built something real through choice. And Clara thought about worth. Not the worth other people assigned to you based on your age or appearance or circumstances, but the worth you claimed for yourself. The worth that came from refusing to give up, from building something with your own hands, from choosing to believe you deserved a place in the world even when the world kept suggesting otherwise. She'd come to Ashford Junction as a discarded woman with almost nothing. She was leaving that version of herself behind, becoming instead someone who owned her own story, who wrote her own ending, who proved that starting over was possible at any age if you were brave enough to try. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and indifferent and beautiful, and Clara Hale, formerly Whitmore, formerly nobody in particular, looked at it all and knew she'd finally found what she'd been searching for. Not rescue, not safety, not even happiness in the way she'd once imagined it, but home and purpose, and the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing she'd earned every bit of it through her own stubborn refusal to be defeated. That was worth more than anything Vernon Hobbs or anyone else could have offered her. That was worth everything.